For nearly a decade, Rory Stewart represented Penrith and the Border in Parliament. As a minister, his briefs covered justice, international development and foreign affairs. Yet it was back in Cumbria where he took to writing pieces for the Cumberland and Westmorland Herald, inspired by the landscape, industry, history and, of course, its people. I'm Nigel Thompson, and in this episode of Northern Lights, we hear in detail from the man who continues to tread his own path. How is life as a former MP, a broadcaster, a podcaster, a historian, an academic? How is your life at the moment?
Well, it's quite bitty. I'm teaching partly in the States. I teach at a university in America. I'm traveling quite a lot because I'm doing quite a lot in the Middle East. I'm missing having a more settled Cumbria-based life. I think one of the things that I realise as I spend more time away is that Cumbria was incredibly settling. I remember just feeling as I got off the train at Penrith that the air was different, the temperature was different from London, and you sort of took a deep breath, whereas I'm now back in the kind of hectic madness of international stuff. Yeah.
It comes across actually your writing style, and I think it's perhaps your sense, as you say, over the years, and it's a 10-year period from 2009. It feels quite you're on a mission. You got something to prove maybe. Whereas at the end, towards the end, and towards to 2019, it's quite relaxed. It's almost like a love letter to Cumbria. You kind of obviously fallen in love with the place, and it's changed.
That's a really interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that, but you're right. I think when you start as a member of Parliament, probably when you start in any job, but you do feel that you've got something to prove, and I certainly felt that. And maybe I wasn't as conscious of it at the time, but I think you're right. Looking back, I was charging around trying to fit in. Often, I think I could get up to 13, 14 meetings a day. So I'd be racing from doing a constituency surgery up in Longtown, and then I'd be down to a meeting with the Lake District National Park, and then I'd be off to see a primary school or a charity, and it was a bit mad. And I think people meeting me at the time probably would have been a bit frustrated with my sort of turning up, charging into the school, doing half an hour, and then saying, I've got to be off because I've now got to drive another 30 miles to get to another meeting. And I never got to the stage that my predecessor's predecessor, Willie Whitelaw, who was the much-loved MP for Penrith and the Border in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, got to, where he was able to just spend weekends playing golf, for example, would say quite straightforwardly, yeah, that's my way of interacting with my constituency today will be to play a game of golf. I never quite got to that stage of zen.
What you did do was walk many miles. I mean, for example, I was reading one of the chapters mentions how far you did walk. I'll just read a little bit from it if I may. This is April 2011. Not sure what the weather was like then, but it must have been good walking weather, because you write, last week I was able to walk from my back garden at Helton to Windermere and Westwater and loop back to Keswick. I was trying to work out the route. That's a heck of a walk.
It was a long walk. It was a long walk. So that took me 3 days, and I suppose they're relatively long days. I mean, it's not a sort of heroic walk, but yeah, I love doing those kinds of things, and that was a great pleasure, because that was a parliamentary break. And as you say, that, I don't know how many listeners know that walk, but that's starting along High Street, which is that beautiful ridgeline,
yes,
on the east side of Ullswater, and then coming down into the north end of Windermere, and then cutting out west. Yes, I loved walking, and I found, I mean, that's obviously more a nature walk, but I also tried to walk through all the villages and hamlets in the constituency, and there were about 100 villages and maybe more hamlets. And that was also lovely, because the lovely thing about walking is that you encounter people accidentally. Whereas when you're in a car, it's very planned. I'm on my way to the meeting with this office. Whereas when you're walking, you might see someone on the road, you might see someone in a field, you might see them walking their dog on the edge of town. And there's that wonderful sense of accident, of encountering people in ways that you wouldn't normally plan to. And sometimes you see things upside down. So you could approach a village from the river and see the backs of the houses rather than the front. And that, I think walking's nice in in interrupting sort of cliched, conventional ways of thinking and getting back to more surprising yourself, making you see landscape and people in different ways.
And because the constituency, which, well, it was, of course, it doesn't exist anymore. It was such a massive rural patch. Did that really help you to get your head around the scale of the place? The fact that Alston to Penrith, it's not a hop and a skip. But also things like, okay, I've had enough walking now. I'll catch the bus. There isn't one.
Yes.
So and also putting yourself in the shoes, literally, of the people who've lived there for generations.
Yes. I mean, I think Cumbria is obviously a very, very special, unique place. But there are two sides of it which are quite unlike other parts of Britain. One of them is the tradition of small farming, particularly in the uplands. And most of those farmers have been in farming families probably forever. I mean, it's not really an easy profession to take up because it's very difficult to acquire land. And so it wouldn't be surprising if some of these farmers are literally descended from Viking farmers. I mean, they might well have been doing it for 1,200 years. And you do get that sense. Sometimes farmers can be quite matter-of-fact and straightforward, but they can show their connection to the soil through humour. I had a friend called Colin up in Bewcastle who was incredibly funny and cynical, but a lot of his jokes revolved around this was his clod of earth, this was his patch, this was his livestock. But other farmers could be extremely sort of lyrical about it. Famously, James Drewbanks, who writes these beautiful books,
yes, yeah,
can take that sense of ownership and turn it almost into poetry. But so that's one bit of it, which is people's whose link to the land, whose sense of ownership of land is quite unlike most people's. It's so rooted, and they're literally fighting with that soil or struggling with a sheep in a snowdrift in a very physical way. And then there's a completely different type of people at the other extreme, which is very large numbers of very energetic young retired people who've often moved from other parts of the United Kingdom. You could be a retired school teacher from Manchester, for example, and you've often got 5 or 6 or 7 different jobs. You might be volunteering in the mountain rescue, you might be organising the half marathon, you might be making something in your home, you could be an environmental consultant in your spare time. There's all that kind of world. And then in between are people who may be related to farming families from old Cumbrian families, but who are now working for the council or working for the NHS or working in education, or running pubs and shops. So but what I love about it is that all these different people are doing thousands of different things. It's not like some parts of Britain where, everybody's working for the same factory. This is it's so complicated that it's almost impossible for any body, inside or outsider, to actually record all the thousands of different things people are doing and choosing to do.
It's very much a mixed economy, isn't it? I mean, it's probably a classic example of somewhere that has had to diversify, and also it still is. I mean, it's still evolving as we speak, and there's lots of things happening at the moment in the world, as you'll certainly be aware of, and people are having to adapt their lifestyle and the way they function to earn money. And also where they live in the future. There's this big story, isn't it, about people leaving Cumbria because the jobs aren't here to sustain it. And again, I just want to bring you back to something you said before about you and your experience in Cumbria, loving the place and getting to know the place. That comes across in the book. I think, as you said at the start of the conversation, you get the impression that you're kind of learning the job, as you've obviously as anybody would, as you went along. And I want to take you back to one particular chapter which caught my 1st of February 2014. It's in the section called No Man's Land, when you were trying to convert the Prime Minister of the day, David Cameron, to come and kind of take more of an interest in Cumbria than perhaps he was. And basically you talk about him coming to the area, having a swim, and then you were offering to kind of spend the evening and tell him more about the area. And he wanted some quiet time. He wanted to just take stock maybe and whatever. What was that conversation like? You obviously felt so passionate about the place that you wanted to make sure that you left with a really clear impression and a love of the place, as you clearly have.
Yeah, it was. So I'd been pushing for a long time to get David Cameron up to visit the constituency because so many things were delayed by number 10. Were we going to get super fast broadband? That was the decision that had to be made in central London. were we going to get the support for what we wanted to do on planning or affordable housing? I really felt I needed to get him up and get him to embrace this place. And so, some older listeners may remember he had this thing called the Big Society that he was pushing for. And I thought, well, Cumbria is the world's greatest example, and almost the only example maybe in the country of actually the Big Society in action. So I want him to see this. So I brought him to Crosby Ravensworth, where the community had done this incredible things. I mean, they had built their own affordable housing, they'd saved the local pub and turned it into a cooperative, etc., etc. And he came very unexpectedly. In fact, I was on a committee trip. I was then in those days in the Foreign Affairs Committee trip to the United States. So I had to jump straight on the plane and come back, because he only gave me 24 hours notice. And then I thought, okay, this is it. He is going to fall in love with this place just as much as I did. And actually, I'm afraid I was really disappointed, because he seemed to sort of just treat it as another trip. Now, I can see with the perspective of time 10 years later, if you think about it, it's the middle of his summer holidays. He's been bullied into coming up to Cumbria. He's got a million other things to worry about. And not surprisingly, he doesn't really want to spend the whole afternoon, evening with me dragging him around Cumbrian villages, telling him how wonderful my constituency is. But it was an interesting tension, because it actually really saddened me. I couldn't see that then. I just thought this was the most wonderful place in the world, and anyone who can't see that, there's something wrong with them.
There was a piece that made me laugh. Let's just share this together if we can. This was an incident where you were I think you were acting as a flag waver, a flag bearer perhaps for Cumbria and for the land. And you'd been encouraged to go and talk to the Water Company, United Utilities, and also the RSPB about their efforts to kind of rewild and look after an area. And I think I love your postscript, because basically in the piece that you wrote for the Herald, which we'll talk about shortly, you likened them to kind of kayak instructors, because they were well dressed, they were kind of looking fit and healthy and the rest of it. And then the postscript says, this piece made the RSPB officer who showed me around the project angry. He felt that having been warm to him at the time, I'd betrayed him by mocking him and his project in this piece. He especially disliked being described as dressed like a canoeing instructor. I wonder why. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think what he was worried about is that my sympathies, generally, I'm afraid, are usually with small farmers. And I'm a bit skeptical about outsiders coming in smart fleeces, telling farmers how to manage their land. I do feel often that one of the sad things, certainly when I was the MP, is this sense that if you are struggling with a small upland farm, you have parades of people in different fleeces with different acronyms: Natural England, Environment Agency, National Park, RSPB, National Trust, coming in, all of them basically trying to tell you that you're not doing it right and that they would do it in a different way. And I think, understandably, he was quite sensitive to that, because he really believed, passionately still believes, I've seen stuff from him recently, that basically sheep are a bad thing and that the world would be better if we didn't have sheep farming in the Lake Districts and if it was rewilded. And I don't like this idea. I don't like this idea because it seems to me to be a real threat to traditional upland farming.
I noticed as well that your attitudes have changed. I mean, in the book, it's good that you kind of reflect on, it's not just a compilation of articles for the Herald. You actually sort of give us like an update of what happens. And for example, wind turbines. I think in one of the chapters you mentioned that actually, with hindsight, I think you concede that you were maybe wrong, that that there is a place for turbines even by the Solway, in areas of very clear visibility. And is this something that this book was perhaps in some way cathartic for you? Perhaps reevaluate your views then and your views now?
Yes, but when you're an MP, you're right in the middle of communities, and you get very, very caught up in community campaigns and never really question them. And I was absolutely convinced that there should be no wind turbines anywhere in the constituency. I actually campaigned for a turbine-free constituency. Looking back on it, I think, can it really be the case that literally there is nowhere in the constituency that can have a turbine? And that now doesn't seem reasonable to me. It now seems that, of course, there are areas of astonishing, important landscape beauty. And, some of those areas are areas around the Northern Lakes. But we have to be able to create space for infrastructure in Britain. And one of the problems we've had with everything from building railways to airports to generating electricity is that understandably everybody's so protective of their own landscape. They're saying anywhere but here. And I realize now that I was contributing to that, and I should have been braver. And maybe we as a community should have found a way to say, okay, maybe there are some places where we can have things.
And one of the things, I think, the successes that I think you achieved as well was broadband. I think you mentioned it earlier in the conversation that at the time, and it seems bonkers now, doesn't it, that there was this kind of competition between different companies to try and make sure they had the best kind of reach and the best area coverage. Whereas, again, in a place like Cumbria, most of Northern England, for example, trying to make that work, that kind of model of competition work, it's impossible because the logistics and the geography just doesn't work. And I think you were able to lobby and successfully campaign for that attitude to change.
Well, there was, look, many people did that. I'm definitely not taking sole credit. And I think one of the lessons of the book is the sense in which as an MP, it's very difficult to know what you've actually done because there are so many other people, local councillors, etc., civil servants getting involved in these campaigns. But the two central things that were my priorities were superfast broadband and mobile phone coverage, which were shocking when I came in 2010. And I think what was interesting is that when I started putting it in my literature 15 years ago, there were quite a lot of people who said, why are you doing this? We don't really care about this. There were people who were against masts because they thought they destroyed the landscape. And there were people who said, we don't really need superfast broadband. In fact, we're quite relieved that nobody can get us. Quite like being in a sort of black spot. I really believe that the only real economic future for remote communities was to be able to use technology to connect to the wider world, that it would allow you to leap barriers of distance. But as you say, it's very expensive. You can run a fiber optic cable into a house in London for, I don't know, a few £100. And a remote farmstead in Cumbria could be tens of thousands of pounds to get that cable to the house. And so, not surprisingly, you could get a situation where officials in London, for example, would say, well, why should we be spending tens of thousands of pounds connecting a house in Cumbria when we can connect, 100 times as many houses in London for the same price? And that was about really trying to get people to understand that you have an obligation to rural areas, that you have to keep them alive, and that we all benefit. This is part of the argument of the book, that actually, in the end, the whole nation, all of England, Scotland, benefits from having a healthy, prosperous Cumbria. That a country which just puts all its resources into London and the southeast and leaves kind of depopulated, impoverished fringes is not a healthy country. But it was a big lift. And occasionally, I feel I did make a difference. Many other people were making a difference too, including a lot of local Cumbrians. There's an extraordinary woman called Libby Bateman, for example, who personally organised a mole plough to dig the trenches near Kirby Stephen to lay her own broadband. She kind of fixed the problem, which the companies wouldn't fix, all the way up the Malastang Valley. Being an MP isn't really about, very difficult to say, I did this, I did that. A lot of that is about giving space to local communities and getting behind them and working out how to promote them. That's, of course, why I was so keen to get people like the Prime Minister up, so that they could see that actually often with Cumbria, it's a question of sometimes just getting out of the way, sometimes just putting a small amount of money behind something that local communities want to do themselves.
The book is called Middleland, Dispatches from the Borders. I just wonder, why the timing now? Why did you choose to pull these pieces together at this moment in time? Was it kind of just a time for reflection, or did you feel the time was right to do it?
Well, I think the time is right. I think we live in a world which talks about politics with a big P, and I'm very guilty of this. I do a podcast where I'm perpetually banging on about Donald Trump or Gaza or Ukraine, and the stakes there seem terrifying. It feels like the whole world is lurching from democracy to authoritarianism, that the very worst instincts of humans are coming out, that we're giving up on our care for other people, we're becoming increasingly selfish and brutal. And we're losing faith in democracy, and we're losing faith in our country, and everybody has this sense that Britain is broken. And I wanted to write this book to show that that just isn't the case. that actually, if you really zoom in and look at a particular group of 70,000 people in Cumbria, the picture is much, much more hopeful, much more optimistic, that actually what makes Britain extraordinary isn't the big politics of Westminster, it's the local communities. It's Crosby Ravensworth building its affordable housing. It's Stephen Collin up on the Bewcastle border making tough farming work. It's the extraordinary work being done to improve our rivers and our environment by many of those people that I was teasing earlier in their fleeces, who do an incredible job. And I think that's where you see Britain at its best. That's where you see these people who are extremely thoughtful, practical, imaginative, tough, funny, endearing, getting stuff done, defending their communities, making life better. And so I think if you were trying to make an argument for the modern world and democracy, oddly, you're better going in really tight and focusing on Penrith and the border rather than trying to talk about China, Taiwan, Gaza, Ukraine. But, we now know that mental health is massively dependent on people's relationship with nature and their relationship with communities and their sense of kind of spiritual purpose and meaning. And what you see in Cumbria is that really does function. I mean, with all the things that we worry about, quite understandably, low incomes, people leaving, unaffordable housing, consistently Penrith and the border was right up at the top in the country on happiness indexes. And that tells you something that's going right, along with all the things that are going wrong.
You mentioned politics obviously changes, and the seats obviously change. There's change at the moment, of course. There's talk, well, there is more than talk, of a mayor for Cumbria. What's your thoughts on that? What do you think that would achieve?
I think that's a wonderful thing, but I think it needs, given that it's the first time Cumbria's had a mayor, it needs to be done with real energy and focus, because it's the first person in the job who really defines what kind of role this is. And there are so many layers of government, national, local, that the mayor will be in a slightly odd position, and people will ask understandably, well, what's really the power of the mayor? What kind of budget do they have? So finding the right person who can really bring that together and champion it and deal with this thing, which partly the book's about, this very ambiguous question of how do you do a role where your power and your budget's a bit ill-defined and yet still make a success of it, is going to be critical. But yes, absolutely. I'm so pleased Cumbria's pushing ahead with this idea. And I think if you get the right person in that role, it could be wonderful.
I've got to ask you, of course, is this something you might be interested in yourself?
Well, my problem is that I'm now an independent. I'm not a member of the Conservative Party or Labour or Lib Dems or Reform, and so yeah, it's a place I love a lot, and if I was honest, of course, it's something I think about a great deal. I just can't quite work out whether in modern politics there's actually space for an independent, and if there isn't, I probably should gracefully step aside in favour of many people who are actually friends of mine who are likely to be running for the other parties.
I wonder that because of the time that we're in politics at the moment is very much in a state of flux. I mean, perhaps the independent is the way to go. The arbiter, the kind of the middle line, as it were. That might just bring various factions together for the good of an area rather than the good of a party. Maybe it's the ideal solution.
I love that idea. I love that idea, but I sometimes worry that there's that although that's absolutely sits with my values and my ideals, there's the practicality of the brutal domination of these parties with hundreds of party members and volunteers and negative campaigning and all the kind of funny stuff they do. So Let's see.
Okay, great. So watch this space. Thanks very much. Brilliant. I just wondered as well, I've got to ask you about the Herald, of course. As local paper media is changing rapidly. And certainly it's a paper that continues to punch above its weight. It's a popular publication, and papers like this in some parts of the country are thriving. First of all, what was it like to be linked to the paper? And did you find that people were very quick to respond to your fortnightly articles? Because, of course, they'd see you in the street or on the walks, wouldn't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, this whole book is a collection of articles from the Herald. I mean, this is just basically the Herald, but collected. And I think the Herald was wonderful. I mean, really wonderful. It's wonderful partly because when we think about democracy works best when you have a good local newspaper. Because it's only with a good local newspaper that you can actually hold people accountable, to use that pompous word. Because it's only with a good local newspaper you can actually talk about what is and isn't happening at a local level. You're never going to get that by reading the Daily Telegraph or the Guardian, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is that the Herald is able to do something nationals don't do, which is carry good news. I mean, frequently national newspapers are pretty depressing, right? Whereas the Herald is actually able often to talk about positive things. And actually, again, without being too wishy-washy, I think our lives could do with much, much more sense of positivity and gratitude. And I think the Herald's an engine for that. And then the final thing is, I just love the privilege. It was a real honor to be able to write quite quirky articles. I mean, the editor let me write sometimes articles on Dark Age archaeology, sometimes articles on a single farmer that I was up with at Bewcastle. Sometimes he'd let me write about Libya. I mean, it was a really privilege to have. And they're not really a classic sort of column you could have in a national newspaper, where the editor just wouldn't let you head off in all those different directions.
Rory Stewart. The book is called Middleland, Dispatches from the Borders, and it's published by Vintage on the 30th of October. I'm Nigel Thompson. Thanks for listening, and subscribe for more podcasts from us wherever you get yours from.